very special guest tonight on Direct Line. Tonight we have the guy that put the son of Sam Berkowitz, behind bars, prosecutor Jim Shalleck, and now candidate for Attorney General. He's going to be the next Attorney General of the great state of Maryland. And we have our great hosts today, Mark Unkefer and Don Irvine. Take it away, guys.
Well, welcome, Jim. It's great
Thank you.
to see you again, and it's
Thank
great
you.
to have you in the race for Attorney General. I think you'd make a great choice. I think if ever there was somebody who was perfectly positioned for what we need in an Attorney General right now, given your background as a prosecutor, you're the guy. So it's great to have you in the race. So tell us a little bit about what made you decide to run now.
Well, I've been thinking about it for a number of months. You know, the stories every night on the news and everything I've been hearing and seeing about crime just has gotten to my soul. And I just wanted to do this to see if my experience I can contribute to this epidemic of crime. And my background, I was a prosecutor for 24 years. It's my background. It's my passion. Law enforcement's always been my passion. I represent police in 6 different jurisdictions in Maryland, the FOPs, and it's something I've always wanted to do. And I wasn't sure if the Attorney General had the jurisdiction that can complement what I want to do, but the Maryland Constitution allows the Attorney General to basically supersede local state's attorneys with the request of the governor or the legislature. And some of the smaller counties, I think, need help. Some of the more brutal, sophisticated crimes, I'm sure they could use help. So I'd like to have as a priority a cadre of top prosecutors in the Attorney General's office to assist or supersede local state's attorneys in cases where we have horrific crimes, mass murders, terrorist attacks. I'm sure they could use the help, and I'm certainly willing to do it. And the Constitution provides for it. The present Attorney General and past Attorney Generals have always concentrated on their civil responsibilities.
Okay.
You know, the Attorney General represents all of the state agencies, represents the state when they're sued, and they do have some jurisdiction. They handle all the appeals, criminal appeals. But in terms of prosecution, they have not done that. I mean, Frosh has spent 2 years going after Trump for making money at his DC hotel, which was eventually thrown out by the courts. So those kind of priorities it's not good for Maryland. It doesn't do us any good. Kids are dying on the streets, and the focus has to be changed. The people deserve that. So I'm ready to go.
That's great news to hear that. Talk a little bit about what we could do differently in Baltimore. I mean, you've got experience, obviously, as a prosecutor in your years were in New York City, but I think you were also at the federal level too.
Yes.
But what should Baltimore be doing differently?
Well, there's a revolving door of justice. I think, you know, it's not just the police, but some of the judges are letting hardened criminals, violent criminals out without any bail. They get slapped on the wrist. The volume is so heavy in Baltimore that plea bargaining is the standard. But you know, you've got to take the most violent and repeat offenders and say no plea bargaining. You got to prosecute them and seek the maximum penalties. So you got to prioritize the violent and repeat offenders. And repeat offenders are very important too. Someone who steals their 43rd car is eating away at society as well. So I would like to see a cadre of top prosecutors in my office go into Baltimore and other jurisdictions and focus on these violent and repeat offenders. No plea bargaining, and you know, go for the max. You know,
Now,
some of these guys are getting slapped on the wrists.
Sure. I mean, there has been one of the issues we should probably talk about is Marilyn Mosby, the state's attorney in Baltimore City. But there has been this, how shall I say, change in philosophy about prosecutions to de-emphasize a lot of crimes, to, for example, not prosecute drug possession charges, not to prosecute prostitution. I mean, tell me about how how you would respond to some of those changes.
Well, first of all, not everybody should go to jail. I mean, rehabilitation is important, especially for young offenders and nonviolent. You know, my philosophy is that these first-time offenders, nonviolent crimes, you have to rehabilitate them, and you have to put them in diversion programs so they can grow as an individual. So jail's not always the answer, but the cancer is these violent repeat offenders.
Mm-hmm.
But also, an obligation of a prosecutor is also to protect the innocent, and that's a crucial component. You know, you've got to make sure that if someone's found guilty and you lock a cell behind them, a cell door behind them, they're guilty. So I'm very sensitive to that. And I'm very sensitive to criticism of the police and the system by minorities. That's a reality. And my office would be very sensitive to young offenders, nonviolent crimes. You just don't lock the jail cell door and throw away the key. And I'm very sensitive to that. And too many young kids got these draconian jail sentences in the 60s and 70s because it was a big fervor over drugs. But if someone has 3 marijuana cigarettes, they shouldn't go to jail. So I'm very sensitive to that. It's a balance, and I hope to uphold that.
There are, of course, quite a few diversion programs that are available to both the courts and the prosecutors to be able to address some of those issues. And I think probably sometimes the arrest and the opportunity to go into the diversion program is something that potentially can save a defendant's life by making those appropriate changes in their own life.
Sure, you send a young kid to jail, he's only going to get worse. I mean, some of these state prisons are very, very difficult to navigate, and for a young kid in with all these hardened criminals, his life is going to never be the same. He's not going to be rehabilitated. He's going to turn to a life of crime, and that's a horrible consequence for a young kid that steals a 6-pack of ginger ale, or has a joint. So you have to be sensitive to that. But the bottom line is the President Attorney General hasn't involved himself in fighting crime and dealing with these issues, and it's about time. The Attorney General has the power to get involved, and the President Attorney General just has been concentrating on going against President Trump, and that's not fair to the Marylanders.
So we do have a question coming in about what about local prosecutors, no papering quality of life crimes and calling out judges who don't do the work. Calling out judges is always a sensitive issue for lawyers, I have to say.
It is. It is tough. And I would say the judges in Montgomery County, it's an excellent group of judges, and they get criticized, but again, not everybody deserves to go to jail. But it's every once in a while you see an egregious situation where someone has raped or robbed and they get probation or a slap on the wrist. So you got to keep an eye on the judges. Now they're overwhelmed with cases. Thousands of cases are in the system. So without plea bargaining, the system falls apart. But you've got to have someone like an attorney general to focus in and make sure that these terrible cases don't slip through the cracks and get slapped on the wrist. So you got to prioritize the worst of the worst.
So that really is one of the jobs of a prosecutor, is to be able to do that kind of prioritization and to appreciate that. Now, one of the issues, of course, is in Baltimore City is this new style of woke prosecutors, and Marilyn Mosby being one of them.
Yes.
That's quite a bit different than the kind of prosecutors that we've had in the past. Can you elaborate a little bit about what are some of the things that they're up to?
Well, it's not only her, but in LA and San Francisco, around the country, there's been a whole group of prosecutors elected who have chosen not to prosecute what they say are minor crimes, car thefts, marijuana, breaking property, and they just feel that it's not warranted to prosecute. But as Rudy Giuliani did when he was mayor, and I was in the DA's office in the Bronx, he had a zero tolerance for crime. Even the men and women that would come up to your car and clean your window while you waited at a red light, he stopped that. So you have to have a personality of a jurisdiction where crime is not tolerated. And people have to think it's real. You know, bad guys and gals have to think that if they get caught, they're going to go to jail. But there's been a whole philosophy around the country of prosecutors not prosecuting minor crimes. But the people committing the minor crimes are also committing the major crimes. So again, this is where you need an attorney general to come in and focus on certain cases. You can't handle all the cases in the state's attorney's office, but you select the ones that stand out, the violent ones, the repeat ones, and you have an attorney general's office focusing on them so they don't slip through the cracks. You have an attorney general in the court prosecuting a case like that. He's prosecuting one case, or she's prosecuting one case or two on the docket. Meanwhile, the state's attorney's got 60 cases on the docket.
Right.
So I want to, you know, be a laser beam on those cases that need special attention. And that'll help, because the worst of the worst are the ones that are committing the horrible crimes over and over.
Talk a little bit about the issue of guns in crime. Obviously, this has been a flashpoint, but it's a kind of complex issue in that, well, I won't speak for you. Go ahead. Talk about the use of guns in crimes in Baltimore.
Well, you know, the bottom line is we have crimes on the books that if you possess a weapon, you go to jail. But the judges haven't been doing that. The prosecutors have been plea bargaining. So if someone has a gun and commit a robbery or a theft, they'll let them plead guilty to the theft, so they don't face a mandatory minimum or a heavy sentence on the gun. Again, this is the volume causing all this chaos. But again, these are the kind of cases that an attorney general should come in and deal with. You got a gun, the attorney general's office can take those gun cases or have a gun unit and focus in on these cases. But there's the laws on the books. I don't think we need any more laws. If you have a gun, it's illegal, you go to jail, period. But they haven't been going to jail because of the plea bargaining that protects them because of the volume. And it's no good. No good. You got a gun, you don't have a license, you go to jail. And that's the bottom line, but they're not. And that's why I want to focus in on getting involved in these cases. And when an assistant attorney general stands up in a courtroom in Cecil County or Washington County, that's gonna put a spotlight on certain cases. And this attorney general and past attorney generals, they're nowhere to be found. You know, they have civil responsibilities, which is constitutional and important, but nothing's more important than saving a kid's life or keeping a gun out of the hand of someone who's going to rape and rob an elderly person.
You know, one way to look at it, and I think sometimes we want to think about the right to be left alone as being a civil liberty, and so many people are having their civil liberties denied by living in fear or being actually subjecting to violence. And some of the concepts about civil liberties probably ought to be turned on their head to talk about the role of government, the role of the city, the role of the state to protect people.
Absolutely. And most of the liberals and people who have that strong sense that you just mentioned, they're all civil libertarians until, God forbid, their child is raped or murdered. Then they become conservative. You know, as a prosecutor for 12 years in the Bronx, I must have ruined like 11 or 12 suits for the tiers that have a lot of salt in them, and they ruin my suits. So until someone is a victim or a parent loses a child, they become conservative then. You know, there's a lot of talk when you're just not affected by crime, but when your family's affected by crime, you get a whole different view, and your civil libertarian bent sometimes goes away.
Although maybe we ought to look at civil liberties in a different perspective, is the right to be protected from the perpetrators of crimes out there.
Exactly. But, you know, unfortunately, things that I'm saying and other people that are tough on crime, sometimes you get painted as someone who's not sensitive to minorities. And that's just the opposite. The minorities are the victims primarily of violent crime. But it's unfortunate that people that espouse the views that I'm espousing sometimes are painted as evil or racist. And there's nothing, that's the furthest from the truth. The minority community is suffering the most, and they know it. They know it.
Talk a little bit about the police. You mentioned, of course, that you've represented the police in the union. Sometimes the allegation is that, we've had instances of corruption on the part of the police in Baltimore. How would you, as Attorney General, would you address those issues?
Well, no one's a bigger supporter or fan of the police than I am. Since I was a young assistant DA in the Bronx, I've always been a friend of the police, have the highest respect for them. But saying that, a dirty cop to me is the worst. If you're corrupt or you're planting evidence on people, to me, that's the worst. I love them, but if you're dirty, you should go to jail. So, I mean, I give them credit. I support them, but if you're a dirty cop, there's no place for you in our society.
Now we have another question about beefing up the public defender's role. You see that as a role for the Attorney General?
I would certainly advocate for that. Absolutely. And by the way, public defenders, sometimes they get a bad rap because a lot of them are fairly young and they don't have the experience or reputation of other private lawyers. But in my experience, public defenders do an excellent job. They're dedicated. A lot of them are younger. They have a lot of enthusiasm, energy, dedication. The problem is their caseloads. I mean, some of these public defenders in major cities have 200 cases. I mean, in the Bronx, they used to wheel in their cases, the public defenders, like with a wheelbarrow. They have like 80 cases in court. But it's the volume that sometimes diminishes their effort. But yes, beefing up the public defender is very important, because there's nothing more important than a good defense. Nothing more important.
Now, one of the challenges that we face in the state is the difference between the way juveniles are treated, and we want to treat juveniles differently, but they're at the cusp of becoming an adult, and they can be drawn into the drug trade or the gang trade, and it seems a bit of a challenge to thread that needle between somebody who's still a kid, but on the other hand, may be intimately involved with basically a criminal enterprise.
Sure. I mean, nobody wants to ruin a kid's life and throw him in a juvenile detention facility and get him on the wrong track in life. But however, in my experience, some of these juveniles have committed the most violent and heinous crimes. Plus, they're repeat offenders too. I've always grouped the repeat offender as bad as the violent offender. Somebody that has stolen 12 cars has caused a lot of havoc with families and people. So they have to be stopped too. So you got to weigh what crime was committed and what kind of record does this kid have to determine whether they get prosecuted as a juvenile or an adult. And a judge makes that final decision. But as a prosecutor, you weigh his background and what he did, because some juveniles are worse than adults in some of the violent crimes. So it's a factual situation. I think I'd always kind of lean towards helping a kid on his way and not putting him in the adult system. But sometimes what they did is so heinous that you have to.
It's a real fact choice that you end up having to make.
Absolutely.
Now, we've spent a lot of time in the last couple of years really focused on the opioid epidemic in the state, and it's a scourge that has touched so many families, both not just in the city but across the state as well. Yeah. What can the Attorney General's office do to help crack down and address those issues?
Well, you have to draw the line between users, addicts, especially young people, and the men and women that are selling it, manufacturing it, transporting it. You have to focus in on them, and a lot of it is gang related, cartels, other gangs. So a gang focus is very important on the importation and the sale of these drugs. But some kid that's got a marijuana joint is certainly different than a cartel that's bringing in tons of fentanyl into the Baltimore harbor. So that you focus on that. You focus on the manufacturers and the sellers, and with the users, you should concentrate on rehabilitation and healthcare.
Now, there has been some speculation about there being a referendum next year on the ballot for decriminalizing marijuana. Any thoughts about that, or do you wait and see to see how it gets shaped out?
Yeah, I'm not in favor of decriminalization. I think there should be some sanction, at least some deterrent or recognition by society that it's not good. I'm not a scientist, but there's a lot of theory that marijuana leads as a gateway to harder drugs. I'm not a doctor, but I wouldn't want to eliminate any sanctions. There should be fines or mandatory treatment or something. But certainly a kid that has a joint shouldn't go to jail, or even 4 joints. So, medical treatment, therapy is the way to go with young offenders and users, but the dealers and the people that bring it in, they bring in tons of this stuff into the harbor. They have to go away for a long time. They have to go away.
Now, we talked a little bit about how Brian Frosch has used the office, and it's been, I think you mentioned kind of the political nature of it, of sort of an agenda. Can you expand a little bit about some of the things that he's done on that?
Well, the thing that comes to mind is his lawsuit with the district attorney. With the Attorney General of D.C. They spent years prosecuting Donald Trump under the emoluments clause, that he was making money while president from his hotel in D.C. And after a couple of years, it was thrown out. And the hotel's in D.C. It's not even a Maryland jurisdiction, right. But it was just his fervor to get Donald Trump. And kids in Baltimore that are getting shot. I think we have to put our attention on those kind of cases and not on political activity. Attorney General can't be political.
Right. Now, the AGs work together with quite a few of other attorney generals, and they do broad kinds of cases. Yes. They've worked together. For example, there's a group of attorney generals, Republican attorney generals, have addressed the social media giants. Tell me about how you think about that.
Well, my view about all these questions you're asking, Mark, is this a Maryland case? Why should the attorney general and his staff get involved if it's not a Maryland matter?
Right.
It seems to me, I can't rattle them off, but it seems to me that Mr. Frosch has gotten together with other attorney generals for national issues. We don't got time and money for that. If it doesn't involve Maryland, if it doesn't hurt Marylanders, if it doesn't affect Maryland, my immediate thought is not to get involved. Involves Maryland, I'm there. But these lawsuits that are nationwide, that's not for the Attorney General of Maryland. It's for the Attorney General of the United States. So if the word Maryland is involved, I'm involved. Maryland's not involved, I'm not involved.
That's a good indicator for figuring out what your priorities are. Now, you talked a little bit about the role of the Attorney General in other areas, and I guess there's some consumer protection roles and what have you.
And they represent the state of Maryland. They represent every state agency has an assistant attorney general assigned to them, and they represent the agencies in courts. And to be candid, I've had a lot of cases with attorney generals in Maryland, and the staff does a good job. They're good lawyers, and I don't criticize the staff, the lawyers. They're good lawyers. I've lost some cases to them, but it's the focus, it's the priorities, and I think a lot of the time they're wasting their energy and their effort. So the staff, no complaints. They do a good job. They're good lawyers, hard workers, but it's the priorities. I can't even imagine how much money and how much staff he utilized to go after Trump. It had to be staggering, because Trump, the lawyers on the other side are the best of the best. Right. So why spend that money and resources on a DC case that was thrown out?
And that's the challenge, is you don't really know, because the salaries are in the budget, but the time of the lawyers is a resource that can't be, is lost when it's misapplied in some other case.
And what I want to do is, I like talking about my priorities. I like to get a group of top prosecutors from even around the country to be part of this major offender bureau to go after these cases we talked about around the state, the most violent and repeat offenders, and have a cadre of really experienced. Maryland's a great place to live. We could attract top prosecutors from all over the country, I think, pay them a good salary, and have a unit that's beyond beyond criticism, and top experienced lawyers. It's a great place to live, and
you call that the major offender unit?
Yeah, something like that. Major offender unit. Yes, something like that. We had a unit like that in the Bronx. We had so much crime in the Bronx that we had to have a unit that just specialized on what I'm talking about, the worst of the worst. Some of these, when I was in the homicide bureau in the Bronx, I had a caseload of like 40 homicides. And that's more than some countries have. I was a young lawyer in the Bronx. But you got to have a unit that says, okay, this is the worst of the worst. I'm going to put all my energy. And, also, if you know the court system, John Smith comes in, or Susan Smith, as a murderer.
Right.
They go to court, 40 times over 2 years with motions and delays and everything. And often that case has a different prosecutor every time it goes into court. And you want to assign one top prosecutor to that case every time it goes to court, so it doesn't get lost in the cracks. So vertical representation, prosecutor A with criminal A all the way. I want to do that too. Concentration, concentration, and no plea bargaining. The case comes in, we prepare for trial, and that could make a dent. And
that would be a huge difference, is knowing the lack of resources now obviously creates a impetus to do plea bargaining when you're putting additional resources on a case. The worst of the worst, as you describe, the defendant and their attorney knows that
you're going to trial.
You're going to trial. There's no deal to be had. There's going to go forward on that.
Right.
Talk a little bit about the worst, your experience with the Son of Sam case. How did that come about?
Well, I was a senior trial lawyer in the Bronx DA's office, and we learned after he committed murders in 3 different counties that they were all related, the same caliber weapon. So each DA, Bronx, Queens, and Brooklyn, appointed a point person, I was the one in the Bronx, to coordinate with the other counties and do the investigation. And I was assigned to handle the 3 murders in the Bronx. So and when he was caught, my involvement was I participated in questioning him. I put the case in the grand jury. I handled with the DA himself court appearances. And then when he pled guilty, I handled the plea in court. He never went to trial, but I was the point person on the 3 Bronx cases. That was some experience, I'll tell you that.
So you had a chance to meet him.
Oh, many times. Many times we were in court together, and I tell you, you wouldn't know. You talk to him. He was a nondescript mailman, and very pleasant. His eyes gave it away, though. He had these very piercing eyes, and you could tell he was a dangerous person just by what he was saying to us. But you could tell he was very different. His neighbor Sam Carr had a dog, and he called the dog the Son of Sam, and he said he was the Son of Sam, and he was driven by the devil to go out and kill, and he certainly had issues. And what's scary about it is how many people live next door to us that are as deranged and as psychotic. You never know. How often do you hear a mass murder guy, and they would talk to his neighbors or her neighbors, and they, oh, he was so nice and sweet, said hello, got my paper, mowed my lawn. Meanwhile, he killed like 4 people. So you never know what's out there. It's scary. It really is. It's rough out there, as I say.
Jim, let me ask you a couple of questions. I mean, going back to something you touched on earlier about the backlog.
Yes.
How do you manage to kind of clearing that up? This seems to be a problem across the country. And then a second question is kind of, what's your position on bail reform?
Well, the solution has come by practical application. They don't charge. Someone gets arrested, prosecutors may not charge all these cases. A case comes in where a guy had a fight with his girlfriend and he slapped her. In a big city, they may not even prosecute it. They may send him to anger management class. So not opening the door to bringing all these cases in the system is one way of keeping the load down. Second, and the most prevalent, is plea bargaining. Plea bargaining is the main way that they keep the volume manageable. And the judges, they have to go along with it. A judge could have 100 cases on his docket and can't handle them, so they plea bargain 83 of them. That's the main way. But now more and more prosecutors around the country are deciding not to even prosecute certain crimes, so it doesn't even get to plea bargaining. And in terms of bail, I can't understand that. There's a philosophy now that it's not fair to hold someone on bond or in jail pending trial because they haven't been convicted. However, if there's a strong case and it's presented to the judge and he's a danger to society, I think they should be kept on a bond or some kind of some kind of hold. Now the courts are very much in favor of putting ankle bracelets on offenders, let them go home, but they monitor them with an ankle bracelet, with curfews and things like that. The whole philosophy now is changed to make sure that a criminal's civil rights and constitutional rights are protected. But I think they've gone too far. I mean, certainly you don't want to keep someone in jail who stole a candy bar on a $10,000 bond. But I think they've gone too far. They've gone too far. But it's not malicious that they're doing it, although some prosecutors I question. But it's the volume. I mean, as we talk, hundreds of cases come into a system for tomorrow morning. So the system needs a lot of help. It's never been funded. It's never gotten the manpower that it needs. Montgomery County, was it 11, 12 judges handle criminal cases? They need more judges, more prosecutors, more defense attorneys. But legislatures don't want to spend money on crime. They want to spend it on projects that help their districts.
Now, we've seen it in looking particularly back at Baltimore City, an ebb and flow of the number of arrests that have taken place. So there was a time when the number of arrests were increased, actually during O'Malley, and in more recent years it has dropped off considerably at the same time that the murder rate has gone up.
Right.
Do you see a correlation there, or is it?
Sure. I mean, a jurisdiction develops a personality that permeates the city, and if it looks like people aren't getting arrested even for minor crimes, there's a personality, there's an attitude that we're not going to get caught, or they're not going to prosecute it, so they're going to let us out on bail. That's why Giuliani was so effective. When he was there, we had about 2,000 murders a year in New York City. Right. And after a couple of years, I think it went down to like 300-400, which is still terrible. But the message was out there. I think he got criticized for it. And now, cops are not arresting people for minor offenses because why waste my time? Why spend 5 hours writing all the paperwork when he's going to be let go in the morning?
Well, it's interesting about Giuliani. I mean, it's there was a gun unit as I recall, in the Giuliani that did a great job of being able to identify. They trained cops to identify the way people carry guns and what have you when they would do stop and frisk, and it had been very effective to pick people up. Giuliani was gone as mayor, and in came Bloomberg, and Bloomberg saw, well, this is such a great policy, we're going to have to do more of that. And So the standards of the quote stop and frisk dramatically changed from where they were on Giuliani, where they went up the number of arrests or not arrests, stop and frisk took place, doubled or tripled. I mean, it really dramatically changed whatever, and included a lot of people who really did not quote fit the profile that the officers had been trained to use at the outset with Giuliani in the early. It's actually, I think, as I recall, it was a transit cops had developed these strategies watching people in the subways, and it was as a result of the ramp up with Bloomberg that the courts came in and said you're just abusing the latitude that you had on stop and frisk, and got slapped down. But there really was this chronology where from where Giuliani had it to where it ended up under Bloomberg was a unfortunate increase.
Well,
so I think that goes to your issue about setting the right balance and understanding that there's not one solution that you apply the most, but you kind of set at the right.
No, you're right, Mark. And it's understandable that stop and frisk has been so controversial because there were abuses.
Right.
Statistics show that minorities were certainly much more prone to being stopped and frisked. So that's a concern, and I'm concerned about that too. But again, this whole philosophy that I have is we've got to target the worst of the worst. So, you can't come in and change everything day one, bail and all this. But you can change what happens to the guy that comes in or the gal that comes in that killed a little kid on the street. You focus in on them, and you can't change the world overnight because you need the legislature, you need a governor, but you can get a real bad person off the streets that in the past has not been off the streets, and that's the focus.
So we have another question about crime-specific courts. Now there have been, well, you can explain a little bit about how that works, and should we have more of that? Does that work as a strategy?
Well, specialization does work. Right now they have mental health courts, they have drug court, and those are all progressive, good ideas. Yes, I like that in terms of prosecutors, to develop within a prosecutor's office different bureaus. Have like a drug bureau, a violent crime bureau, domestic violence bureau, because then the prosecutor develops an expertise in certain crimes. That's a good idea.
Should there be specialization with the judges doing that, or can we do that?
Well, I don't have a full answer on that, but you don't want a judge to get pigeonholed into one type of case. So I kind of lean against that. But prosecutors with specialization is a good idea. In the Bronx, we had an arson bureau, a sexual offense bureau, murder bureau. So those prosecutors, and they can rotate after a few years if they're not happy or they're not doing well. But it develops an expertise in certain crimes. And certain crimes, white-collar crimes, it's a whole different type of crime. Sophisticated, mostly paper-intensive. So a prosecutor who's great at white-collar work may not be a good homicide prosecutor. A lot of personality involved too. To be a homicide prosecutor, you got to be a banger. You know what I mean? You got to be tough. White-collar people are more, I guess, paper intense, more subdued, if you know what I mean. But no, these are all good suggestions. But my frustration is, being involved in politics over the years, that the Attorney General does nothing about crime. I mean, there's no initiatives, there's no unit, there's nothing except the civil case representations, which are important. But I think you need a statewide official to say, no, I'm coming into Cecil County or Washington County or Talbot County, and we've got the firepower to help you and to deal with this guy that just burned down a school. And, I want to make that available. And I think the prosecutors would appreciate it. Some of these counties have one prosecutor or two, and then very not experienced. So if we can help, it's something I want to do.
Now, I assume one of the issues particularly in the gang area, they don't necessarily follow the jurisdictional boundaries of our counties, which are the units in which we elect our state's attorney. So it seems like would the Attorney General be helpful in being able to work across boundaries to be able to make those kinds of prosecutions?
Absolutely, absolutely. But also, in the major gang issues, the feds would come in too. If you have a major drug importation gang or gun selling gang, the feds often will come in because it involves, numerous jurisdictions. So the feds are available and they do great. But yes, if it's like Prince George's, Montgomery, and Howard, the Attorney General can coordinate and do that. That's an excellent use of the Attorney General's office as well.
Great.
Yeah.
So let's talk. There's some other areas. There are other units in the Attorney General's office. Environmental crime. We've already talked about the civil processes. Are there areas that you would de-emphasize, or would you simply give people a little, just shift resources somewhat?
Well, you want to shift resources to my priorities, but also I think there should be a focus on elder abuse, nursing homes and elder abuse. That's something that I think has to have a bigger commitment. You see what you got to be flexible. You got to be flexible. But if you got the right people, you can be flexible, and you got the right attitude, and you have a governor or legislature, because they have to sign off when the Attorney General would supersede a state's attorney. So you got to have cooperation too. If you have a governor and a legislature that's hostile to prosecution, that could be a problem. So there's politics involved in everything, and that's something we have to be aware of.
So it sounds like one of the big responsibilities of the Attorney General is really hiring these staff to be able to carry out those kinds of the kind of priorities that you've expressed. What do you look for in a good prosecutor?
Well, you look for their experience. I've always said that the Bronx was the greatest place to train to be a prosecutor. So big cities are great training grounds for violent crime. I handled hundreds of murder cases in my career, whereas someone from a small rural area probably handles none. So, I would look at big cities. Washington is a great reservoir of prosecutors. And I'm sure there's great prosecutors in the Attorney General's office. But you look for experience and dedication and that certain personality that they're committed. That certain personality, that certain experience. You can tell. You can tell who's a hard charger when you interview them.
So that's really what you're looking for. What is your philosophy in juries as a prosecutor?
I'm a big fan of juries. I got more faith in juries than judges and prosecutors. I have a big cheer for juries. They, in my experience, they do the right thing. They follow the law. They're compassionate when they have to be. They're tough when they have to be. But overall, I've found juries to be probably the best part of our system, and they take it serious. And once in a while they may, they'll render a verdict that people disagree with, but generally they do a great job. They listen carefully, they follow the judge's instructions, and they do what they have to do. It's not easy. Nobody wants to be a juror, I don't think. But I'm a big fan of juries. I have more faith in a jury trial than a judge trial. Judges have too many pressures on them. They don't want to be on the front page of a newspaper. They don't want to be politically in trouble. So, or in trouble with the Bar Association. Juries are anonymous, and I have more faith in juries not being swayed by publicity, politics. They do the right thing.
That's an interesting. Well, we're coming up towards the end of the show, so I just want to kind of give you a kind of an opportunity if you have any sort of closing remarks about your thoughts about going out on this campaign for Attorney General.
Well, thanks, Mark. I've been active in the county for a long time. I've run for state's attorney and county executive. So I know how hard it is to be a Republican in Maryland. But still, I've always felt the worst that can happen is you lose. And I've always felt that the losers are the ones with a passion and dedication, but they don't get on the playing field. They sit in the bleachers, throwing bombs. So I'm ready for the task. You know, it's a big task, and I appreciate all the help I can get. But I'm just hoping that in this race, people look beyond politics. It's not easy in a state like this, but I just hope they just don't vote party line. They realize that if I'm elected, my priority is going to be on crime. There's not a Republican or Democratic way to prosecute a murderer or a rapist. And that's what I want to do. My whole career has been geared towards doing something like this, and I'm happy to do it. And thanks for having me. I appreciate it. This is like my first interview, and I appreciate it. I appreciate it very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jim.
Thank you. I really
Great.
appreciate it. Good seeing you.